From the European Parliament here in Brussels, this is Raw Politics. Thank you for joining us tonight, and this is what we have coming up on the program. A rock and a hard place, the new headache over Gibraltar for negotiators. All right, it is time to meet our panel for tonight. Joining us is William Legge, Earl of Dartmouth, and an independent MEP who belongs to the Freedom and Direct Democracy Group. Which one
Good evening.
are you watching? Which of these stories did you like?
Gibraltar, Gibraltar and Gibraltar.
Absolutely. All right, watching Gibraltar, and that's exactly where we will be beginning tonight, because Chief Brexit negotiator Michel Barnier may have a new thorn in his side. Spain is threatening to reject the draft withdrawal agreement as foreign ministers meet in Brussels to sign off on the future relationship between the UK and the EU. And it all comes down to the disputed territory of Gibraltar. Now, Spanish Foreign Minister Josep Borrell says that Madrid should get a special veto on any future trade agreement between the EU and the UK, because he says the current agreement does not cover Gibraltar. And the British-owned peninsula located on Spain's south coast will no longer be part of the EU once the UK leaves in March. And now Spain is being criticized for raising the issue at the last minute, just days before a crucial summit in Brussels. Well, the Spanish Foreign Minister Josep Borrell said that negotiations between the UK and the EU do not apply to Gibraltar and are separate negotiations. And then he said, in Europe, it is not over until it's over. You have always got to be prepared for a surprise at the last minute. All right, let us talk about this. What happened there? I'll start with you, Nina. You know, for all the talk about the Irish border, the backstop, did we just forget this little place called Gibraltar? What happened there?
Look, I don't think that politicians have really forgotten this. This has been a thorn in the negotiations, very complicated negotiations from the beginning. And I really doubt that Michel Barnier hasn't had parallel conversations with his Spanish counterparts about this issue over the last 2 years. If I was being really cynical, I would say, perhaps Spain has piped up about the issue of Gibraltar right now in order to let Theresa May have a win. So at least domestically, it plays out really well. I think I can safely put my money on the fact that this issue will not be sinking the Brexit deal at this moment. I think throughout the negotiations, the domestic volatility and uncertainty has been getting this deal through Parliament. I don't see that happening on the EU side. I don't think the EU kind of 27 will sink what's on the table right now.
Is this a particular strategic play? I mean, the timing of it, what do you think?
Well, all Spanish governments have been, since Franco regime, using Gibraltar for electoral purposes. There is no budget in Spain because socialist government is unable to get support for that. So let's take Gibraltar issue. 5 days ago, Prime Minister Sanchez said that the agreement was fine. And today, the foreign minister comes out with this. So I want to warn...
But they said they weren't briefed properly. That's the reason they were giving. They did not see.
Let me warn all Europeans the concept of democracy that the Spaniards has, because they don't have any respect for the will of the Gibraltarians that some years ago voted in a 98% in a referendum to remain British. And this declaration of the Minister of Spain doesn't take into account the will of the people of Gibraltar. This is very dangerous, as we think that EU is a democracy.
All right, so how big of an issue could this become, and bring us the British point of view as well?
It's very, very important. It's very important for people in Gibraltar. And I must, if I may, take issue with your introduction, calling it a disputed territory. It isn't a disputed territory. It's been a British territory since 1711. It's now self-governing. And as my colleague here has very ably pointed out, they want to stay part of Britain and they don't want to be part of Spain. Now, if you're an MEP, you endlessly hear people rabbiting on about European values. And one of the most important European values, perhaps the most important one, is self-determination. So it is absolutely offensive, frankly. It's offensive, actually, to watch the European Union nomenclatura seeking to deny people of Gibraltar self-determination, as they're doing in Catalonia as well. But that's probably another subject you don't want to talk about.
I realistically don't think that's what's on the table. Nobody's saying that Gibraltar is now has to remain part of the EU. If you want to talk about the democratic will of the people, it's quite clear that Gibraltarians want to remain part of the UK, and it's also quite clear that they actually didn't want to leave the EU, because if you look at the result of the referendum in Gibraltar, you know, they distinctly did not want to leave. So it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I really don't think, like I said, I think this is all a bit of domestic optics and power play. I really don't think what's on the table is that somehow the EU or Spain is trying to rip Gibraltar away from Spain.
That's what you were trying to point out, but it is two separate issues. So, okay, where do we go from here then?
Well, where we go from here is that this agreement is awful, as I've said elsewhere, on other matters, which I'm sure you don't want to hear about. However, the one vaguely okay thing about it, and I did put out a statement, was just saying that those provisions of it which apply to Gibraltar were okay and even quite good for Gibraltar. Now, if these are going to be torn away, we in the UK are left with absolutely less than nothing. Less than nothing. And I'll make one other point too. The European Union negotiators keep on saying that the agreement cannot be changed. If it can change in the context of Gibraltar, it can be changed in the context of a large number of other things. And I'll give you about 5 examples straight away, which I'm sure you don't know.
Let me say that, in my opinion, this is a firework for the Spanish foreign ministers, because if at the end Theresa May gets the support in the British Parliament to go forward with this agreement, Spain will not resist the EU pressure.
Do you agree that it's domestic optics?
Yes. This has been looking for the possible next snap Spanish elections.
Okay, so
there is no way that Spain is going to sink the deal that's on the table, not after all the effort that has been invested by both the European side and the British side to get to the point where we are now.
So what is the point of making this noise, though?
Then why are they making noise?
All of the instability is around whether or not Theresa May can get it through her parliament at home. And I think, incidentally, the first time she tries, she's not going to be able to. So it helps her to look like she's put up a fight, you know, and Spain has backed down. That helps her to sell this deal to the hardcore Brexiteer right of her own party. That has always been the dynamic as the negotiations have folded out. And in terms of this being a bad deal, I mean, this was inevitably the deal that Britain was going to get. There is not going to be a wholesale renegotiation of what's on the table.
There's a lot more, obviously, happening in Brexit, and where Theresa May, you know, where we will be seeing Theresa May in the weeks and days to come. You know, we've been hearing today there's been a lot of focus on EU countries' reaction to the Brexit deal that Theresa May has put forward, but there's been plenty of action in London. Let's catch up on all the latest developments on that side. Don't look down. Theresa May's position at the top of British politics is in need of more than a bit of structural support this evening. Because last night, at this ordinary-looking session of the House of Commons, the DUP fired a warning shot at the Prime Minister. The Unionists, on whose support the Conservatives rely to stay in power, abstained on a number of amendments to the government's finance bill. Make no mistake, this was a moment of high drama in Westminster, with one senior opposition figure suggesting that Labour should now be given the opportunity to form a government. And there's no sign of clearing skies for Theresa May. The British Prime Minister last night bowed to pressure from MPs, including some of her own, and agreed to publish economic forecasts comparing her Brexit deal with remaining in the European Union. Pro-EU campaigners hope this will chip away at the case for leaving the EU. Mrs. May, on the other hand, may be left trying to sweep unhelpful economic projections under the carpet. And could these be the so-called men in grey suits? Members of the Brexiteer European Research Group marched on Downing Street last night to meet with the Prime Minister. 1 hour later, they emerged and, much to the disappointment of the awaiting media, did not speak to the press. With reports suggesting their meeting was constructive and Brexiteers struggling to trigger a no-confidence vote, has Theresa May's moment of maximum danger now passed? Well, Tory MP and Brexiteer Jacob Rees-Mogg continued to slam Theresa May for her draft deal today. He held a press conference with other pro-Brexit MPs and industry leaders, calling for a harder Brexit and a future Britain without Mrs. May at the helm. Well, let's take a look. But what caught our eye here. It wasn't necessarily the content of the panel, but what it looked like. These representatives, the European Research Group and Global Britain, would like to design an alternative picture to what a post-Brexit future would look like. And if it's anything like this picture, the future may look a little bit like the past. So there we have it. When we look at that, is this a taste of what Theresa May is about to face? I mean, the DUP has fired a warning shot.
Look, as I mentioned, everyone is unhappy with the deal, whether you're a Remainer or a Brexiteer or you're DUP. Everyone does not like what's on the table because fundamentally the assessment is that Britain is going to be in a worse place than when it was before. Now, where opinions differ is that, the hardcore Brexiteers say that's because Theresa May is a bad negotiator, because Ollie Robbins, her chief negotiator in the cabinet, has kind of done some stitch up. The EU is punishing the UK. But I think realistically, if you consider the Tory party's red lines and the fact that this was always going to be a damage control exercise, this is inevitably where the UK would end up vis-a-vis the negotiations. As I've already said plenty of times on this programme, the big problem for Theresa May is getting it through Parliament. And as to actually anybody challenging her, I don't see anyone being able to step up and having to take her position right now. So I still think my base case is she remains PM and manages to get the deal, maybe not on the first try, but somehow through the Parliament.
But if you look at the opposition, that very diverse picture that we saw there of the Brexiteers, are they finally getting their act together? I mean,
with respect, this isn't the point at all. The key point is that Labour are committed to voting against it.
Yeah.
With Labour voting against it and the DUP voting against it, which it's apparently that they will, it's over anyway, irrespective of how many Brexiteers vote against it, which will be somewhere between 40 and 80. The fact of the matter is, this deal will not get past the House of Commons. It will not get past the House of Commons, certainly the first time. Now, maybe it will get past the second time or the third time, with the government making all sorts of threats. But if you get in a position that the government starts to threaten its own people, it's not a very healthy position. It's a lousy deal. It doesn't command any support from anywhere in the political spectrum, not just from grey-haired males like myself. And that is the key point. The key point is Labour is going to vote against it.
Right.
With the support of the DUP and the minority parties and a large number of Conservatives.
But all the Labour Party will vote against?
And
they're committed to voting against it.
Yeah, so if watching this from this side of the channel, what are the expectations from the EU side if looking at the scenario in London?
Well, today I wear a Scottish tie, so this is why I...
Is that why?
Because the SNP... Yes. No, it is... Well, for my personal view, this is a good agreement because we want to continue at least having trade with the UK.
But knowing that it's not going to get through,
yes,
given the numbers.
I'm not an expert in British politics, so maybe you are right, but I have doubts about that the all Labour MPs will vote against as a bloc. And I think that Theresa May will get more support in her party. So maybe there are...
Theresa May will definitely get some Labour MPs backing her deal. The questions of how many, if you do the kind of parliamentary arithmetic, it looks like right now impossible to get the deal through. But I think as the realization hits that there is no going back and renegotiating the deal, and therefore if the deal is not voted through, the next most likely option is the chaotic Brexit, a no-deal Brexit. I think with some cosmetic changes, it will get through on the second.
And as if she hasn't already been facing enough pushback, she is facing even more pushback after saying that EU nationals will be no longer able to, quote, jump the queue into the UK job market post-Brexit. And for more on this, I am joined by our London correspondent, Vincent McAviney. Vincent, what exactly was Theresa May trying to sell there by saying that?
Good evening, Tessa. Well, these are comments made by Theresa May at the CBI conference, and that's an audience there of business leaders. She was talking about the plans, and what she actually said wasn't new. It's been something that's been spoken about for the last couple of months, that the UK will move from low-skilled immigration to high-skilled immigration. The Prime Minister wants to attract the top talent from around the world, and really what she's reacting to is a feeling during the Brexit referendum that the UK had opened opened its borders too wide, that there was too much migration. And when you do look into the figures, the migration David Cameron once promised to bring down into the tens of thousands, but in 2015 it peaked at 332,000 net migration, and of that 184,000 came actually from the EU. Now, it had climbed since the expansion of the EU in the early 2000s, but this number was the trigger that many believe led to that vote to leave in 2016. So Theresa May knows that immigration has to be tackled, and here is what she had to say.
Once we've left the EU, we will be fully in control of who comes here. It will no longer be the case that EU nationals, regardless of the skills or experience they have to offer, can jump the queue ahead of engineers from Sydney or software developers from Delhi. Instead of a system based on where a person is from, we will have one that is built around the talents and skills a person has to offer.
Now, other countries mentioned by Theresa May include New Zealand, Australia and India, those countries that make up the Commonwealth. And there was actually quite a large vote from people from the South East Asian community living here in the UK for Brexit, because they wanted to be able to reopen those links to countries that the UK has historical ties with. And the Prime Minister also mentioned America as well. Her hope is that quite quickly, or after whatever happens on the 29th of March, whether we leave the EU with her deal or we leave in the chaotic Brexit, the no deal, that a deal can be struck with America that would see greater migration between the two countries.
Yeah, Vincent, I mean, this is, as you say, this is something that she has said before, but this time she's saying it in the context of a Brexit, a draft deal that we've all seen. Why is she getting all this backlash?
Well, I mean, Theresa May has played a very careful game on this red button issue. She went out very quickly in the negotiation period saying she wouldn't treat EU citizens as negotiating chips. She assured them very quickly that they would have the right to stay, and she also said even in the event of no deal they would have the right to stay. But there is a backlash coming because of the language. So Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the Scottish National Party in Scotland, criticised it as saying it was really disgraceful, about queue jumping, and there was also a backlash from business. The director of the CBI, the event she was speaking as, said that free movement of people is ending and a new immigration system represents a seismic shift, one that firms across the country need to adapt to, but it's a false choice between high and low skilled workers, would deny businesses from house builders to healthcare providers the vital skills they need to succeed. So businesses are sounding a warning that there isn't the amount of low skilled labour needed in the UK to keep the economy ticking along as it is. Particularly they're mentioning the housing sector and the care sector. There is a huge void in the gap, there's a huge gap in the skill set here to provide in those industries. All
right, thank you for that. Vincent McAviney live there for us in London. All right, Theresa May, she was using that kind of rhetoric, that kind of language. Was she framing it a certain way to try and sell it a different way, you know, to business leaders in her particular audience?
She's definitely trying to frame it in terms of trying to sell her Brexit deal, because if you are of the view that, you know, the British public voted for Brexit in part because of concerns around immigration, she has to be really tough on, you know, ending free movement and what this means for the UK's immigration regime. And that's indeed one reason why the UK is leaving the single market, right? Its biggest market on its doorstep, because it wants to end free movement. In terms of EU nationals jumping the queue, I mean, actually that's not true, because the UK is able to set its rules for non-EU immigration as it wants. It has nothing to do with EU free movement. So if it wanted to let in more Indian engineers or doctors, there's nothing preventing the UK from doing that. And I think that what business is concerned about now is that this kind of arbitrary rules-based system, which Theresa May says she wants to enforce, is not necessarily going to deliver for the needs of the economy. You already see that, for example, in the numbers of EU migrants leaving the UK and how that's affecting key industries in the UK, not least the NHS.
Yeah, so it's basically just empty words.
No. It's actually very important. First of all, the Confederation of British Industries, who they were talking to, they're all immigration junkies. If they want to solve their labour problem, they should simply train people better and pay people more, and they would solve it absolutely immediately. But the very important point, and I partly agree with you, your emphasis was, I think, a bit off colour. At the moment, citizens of EU member states are in a privileged position in the sense that, irrespective of their qualifications, even if they have none, irrespective of their skills, even if they have none, irrespective of their earning ability, even if they have none, they have the absolute right to live, work and settle in the United Kingdom. By comparison, if you are an Australian cancer surgeon, if you are an Indian nuclear physicist, if you are a Canadian solar energy specialist, you have to take your place at the back of the queue. Now, it's just a question of fact that on Brexit, the privileged position ceases. And I don't see why that should attract the kind of abuse which it seems to be getting.
But as Nina was pointing out, it's not actually true. You can jump the queue if we were to use that term even now.
No, but you don't have you don't. You don't have an absolute right. If you're a citizen of an EU member state, you have an absolute right. And there's a distinction between being able to get in and having an absolute right. One further point, it's really very important. Your correspondent there quoted the figure of 323,000 net in 2015. The gross figure was 650,000. So in the last 5 years, if you look the figures up, which I did just before coming on the programme, we've had over 500,000 gross people coming into the country each year. In 2 years, we had over 600,000. And the fact is there's a national consensus, there's a national consensus in the UK that this has got to be managed. And that's all this is. Now, I'm not in the same political party as the Prime Minister, and I haven't been for many, many years, but she's absolutely right on this. And the so-called backlash from the immigration junkies and the usual suspects and the people who are in favour of unrestricted immigration should just be ignored and faced down. And I very much hope the Prime Minister does do that.
There is no problem in saying you want to have lower immigration in your country. That's a perfectly valid position for a government to take. Nonetheless, what the government then has to do is honestly talk about the economic trade-offs that entails. For example, when it comes to EU migrants in the UK, by the UK Treasury's own estimates, they are a net contributor to the tune of £7 billion a year. So I think what people are not liking in terms of her tone is that she's trying to make out that EU migrants are somehow scroungers or not contributing to British society, which they are. And I think, I'm a good example. I've been living in the UK for 15 years. I am definitely a contributor to the
you
UK.
wanted to say?
Yeah, just to say that I share your view, the Nina's view, because I understand that it was a concern and there was an argument for the Brexiters to have control of the borders. But I think that Prime Minister should be very careful looking at the accurate words to explain not only to the British citizens but also to the European citizens what we are talking about. Because, for instance, from Spain there is a lot of nurses and doctors that are working in the UK, and what are you going to do next year?
Well, where they can continue to work there, and they continue to work there on a work permit basis for people coming in the future. People who are currently working there, the Prime Minister has been absolutely clear that they have the right to remain whatever happens. So we're only talking about the thing in the future. One tiny also correction.
Okay.
Yes, it's 7 billion, but this is a 2.5 trillion economy. 7 billion is really not very material, actually.
Because the actual number of immigrants isn't very high.
Well, we can all check
nobody
these
else
figures
thinks that. It's about 5 million. Is that high or low? Most people think it's rather high.
All right, thank you.
But you'll tell me it's not.
We'll have a lot more Brexit talk, definitely, for in the coming days, for sure. All right, and a lot more coming. All right, thank you very much for joining us tonight on Raw Politics. We'd like to see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. Good night.